We're winding up on the plagues. Welcome to folks here in the sanctuary. Welcome to folks online. And it is week 3 of our look at the book of Exodus, which is one of my favorite books. And we had gotten through 8 of the 10 plagues. I may be a little bit loud. Let's see. Am I a little bit loud to everybody? Yeah, I'm a little loud. Let's get me down a little bit less. Which is good for the live stream. We had gotten through the first 8 plagues and ready for the final 2. So we are ready for chapter 11 of Exodus. And as we said last time, as we looked at the plagues, in this chart that I found, many scholars say that these are not just random misfortunes visited upon the Egyptians, that these are very specific in terms of each plague in some ways being a challenge to one of the Egyptian gods, starting with the sacred Nile River and going through, all the multitude of the pantheon of Egyptian gods, with the frogs, which is one of the Hecht being an Egyptian goddess with the head of a frog, and on through the plagues on the cattle and the plagues on the boils and the hail and the locust, all of these being various Egyptian gods that would, in the Egyptian mind, were controlling the livestock, the weather, the insects, etc., that each one on this little chart is a direct refutation of the power of an Egyptian god. And they get progressively worse, and as we've seen, if you just to refresh from last week, the pattern that we see repeated really over and over is Moses says, "Let my people go," or there'll be this plague, and Pharaoh says no, and the plague happens, and the Egyptians are suffering, and the Pharaoh calls them in and says, well, okay, you can go, and then Moses makes the plague cease, and Pharaoh changes his mind and says, no, you can't go. Or, in some cases, the Pharaoh tries to bargaining and says, well, okay, the men can go worship in the wilderness, or, he wants to compromise, and Moses will not compromise. He will not, he says, all of us, our men, our women, our children, our cattle, our animals, everything, we all have to go 3 days' journey out into the desert to sacrifice to Yahweh. And the Pharaoh suspects that if I let him go 3 days' journey away, they'll never come back. Our labor force, our forced labor force, our slaves will never return. So he's unwilling to let this happen, especially of him to bring with them women, children, animals, everything. He keeps, when the plague gets bad, he says, okay, you can go, just take away this horrible thing. Then he reneges on his promise after the plague is gone. And this pattern is repeated. We see it over and over and over. And so we come down to the last 2, and darkness is now going to be the 9th plague. So that's chapter 11. And we read there, the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand towards the sky so that darkness will spread over Egypt. Darkness that can be felt. Which some scholars think that means sandstorm. Not like an eclipse, but more a darkness that can be felt when there's a sandstorm in that part of the world. Literally, you cannot see your hand in front of your face. It is complete blocking out of light with one of the serious sandstorms. So that's why some think this plague of darkness is not like, as I say, an eclipse or something. It is more about a sandstorm. But the bottom line is Ra is the sun god. And the Pharaoh is considered to be either an incarnation of the sun god or a son, S-O-N, of the sun, S-U-N god. It is like the sun god Ra is at the top of the list of gods. So this is a challenge to the greatest, really, of Egyptian gods, Ra, to darken the sky, to block out the sun. And so he says, a darkness will cover Egypt that can be felt. That's why some think we're talking about a sandstorm. So, verse 22, Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and total darkness covered all of Egypt for 3 days. No one could see anyone else or leave his place for 3 days. Yet, all the Israelites had light in the places where they lived. Again, makes it sound like, if it was an eclipse, how would there be light in some places and darkness in other places? So that's, again, to the theory that we're talking about a blocking of the sun by a sandstorm. So Pharaoh summoned Moses and said, "Go," 24, "go worship Yahweh. Even your women and your children can go with you. Only leave your flocks and your herds behind." Now, a slave labor force, probably the amount of herds and cattle is not huge. Would this be a devastating blow to Egypt to lose those animals? Probably not. But Pharaoh is unwilling to completely capitulate. He's got to save face. He's got to say, well, I'll meet you halfway, but I cannot accede to all of your demands. We have to, I cannot totally surrender to your demands. So he's like, well, okay, you can go, but you can't take your animals with you. But Moses responds, "You must allow us to have sacrifices and burnt offerings to present to Yahweh our God. Our livestock too must go with us. Not a hoof is to be left behind. We have to use some of them in worshiping Yahweh our God. And until we get there, we won't know what we are to use to worship Yahweh." So, we're not sure what kind of animal might be required to sacrifice, so we have to take all the animals. We have to take everything with us. But, verse 27, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. He was not willing to let them go. Pharaoh said to Moses, "Get out of my sight. Make sure you don't appear before me again. The day you see my face, you'll die." It's like, this is the last straw. Moses has never been willing to budge an inch. And he's like, "Get out of here. I'm done with you. I'm done bargaining with you." Verse 29, "Just as you say," Moses replied, "I'll never appear before you again." Which actually is not quite true, because there is actually one more brief encounter. But this is just an exchange of unpleasantries. Now, we get to the Passover, the plague on the firstborn. And before we go into that, let me talk a little bit about where the Bible came from. And I think you'll see why I'm talking about this as we get to this. Most of the time, and I've broached this occasionally in different sermons or Bible studies across the years, but most of us growing up, maybe we never really think about, well, where did the Bible come from? It's just always there. Maybe you thought, well, it just, fell out of the sky, although you didn't really believe that, but it's like, well, it's just always there. Then we start to get older, and we do a Bible study, and we kind of think, well, okay, it was written by people inspired by the Holy Spirit to write the Scriptures, these 66 books. We know these 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament, 26 in the New Testament, were written by dozens of different people over hundreds of years. So the Bible is a library of 66 books written by all kinds of different people over centuries of time. But even there, if you think of the book of Exodus, here is somebody, and the tradition is that Moses is the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, that Moses is the author of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Almost no scholar, conservative, liberal, or anything else, believes that Moses is the author of all 5 of these books. Because one reason being, in the Deuteronomy, it records Moses' death, which would be a pretty good trick to write that part of the story, or write about the story of his own death and burial. What do most scholars believe about these 5 books? Well, most scholars, again, not just of one stripe or one school or one type. Most scholars believe that most of the stories, especially the most ancient stories in Genesis, the garden narratives of Eden, the flood story, the Tower of Babel, the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and that those were told and retold orally before they were ever written down. That these are stories, remember the vast majority of people are illiterate, most people can't read and write, that most of the stories are told around campfires, passed from father to child or mother to child for generation after generation after generation after generation, until finally a scribe or a rabbi or someone takes these stories that the whole community has told and retold thousands of times and actually writes them down. And so, Adam, if you take the Genesis stories as very literally, which most people don't, but if you take those stories, Adam is not writing a running account of what's happening in Eden. Noah didn't get off the ark and write down, well, this is what happened on the ark. These stories get told and retold and retold and retold, and finally written down and edited and pieced together. And these books are not like somebody today when Stephen King sits at a typewriter and writes a book. These are books that are put together across generations in the form we have them. Now, I still, and I hope you, and I still believe they are inspired by God. God is still, the word inspired means God breathed. That God's breath, God's spirit is still at work in that process. God's inspiration is still at work in that process. But as I often talk about, Jesus is fully God and fully human. Jesus is the divine incarnation of God, and yet he sweated, and he got hungry, and he got thirsty, and he probably stubbed his toe, and he may have had acne as a teenager, on and on and on. He's fully human, and he's fully divine. 100% human, 100% divine. I think of the Bible in the same way. The Bible is divinely inspired, but it's still, God uses human authors to record these events and the inspiration, but it's still from a perspective often of a person living at a certain time in a certain place, or writing down the stories that the community has told and retold for generations. And I say all that as preface because when you get to the story of the Passover, here's I was trying to think, how would you compare the story of the Passover, the way we read it, which is their meaning the Jews, central story, to our central stories. Imagine if you were reading Luke and Matthew's account of the birth of Jesus, and it read like this. And then Mary gave birth to her firstborn son, a boy, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger, for there was no room in the inn. And that is why we sing Away in a Manger every Christmas. If that's how the Bible read. That after it said they laid him in a manger, it said, oh, and that's why we sing Away in a Manger every year. And then Magi came from the east, bringing with them their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And that's why we sing We Three Kings every year at Christmas time on Christmas Eve. If that's how the Bible read, you would go, we're mixing stuff up here. We're mixing the account of the event with how we celebrate the event. We're mixing together an account of the events with an account of how to celebrate that same event. The New Testament doesn't read that way, but the story of the Passover does. The story of the Passover mixes the story of the angel of death passing over the Hebrew people before they were finally allowed to leave slavery in Egypt with, and this is how you celebrate Passover. And this is the way you celebrate it. And you do this, and you do this, and you gather this. If you read the account, you realize that interspersed with the account of the Exodus is details about how future generations are to celebrate it, and did celebrate it. And if you read it all as if it's happening at the time of the Passover, it's like they wouldn't possibly have time to do all of this preparation. of ridding every house of yeast, and then waiting this many days, and then selecting a spotless goat or lamb, and then roasting it in a certain way, and then having the kids sit at the table, and they go through this ritual. And they were like, they had to, the whole reason for things like matzah, unleavened bread without yeast, is they didn't have time to let the bread rise. They had to get out now. They had to leave now. There wasn't any time for the bread to rise. They had to eat the bread without the yeast and get out of Dodge, get out of town. But when you read the account of the Passover, you'll see mixed in with the story of the Exodus instructions on how to celebrate it after the fact. Okay? Does that all make sense? And you'll see that as we look at it. So let's look at chapter 12. So, actually, we'll have to go back to chapter 11. I'm sorry. We'll start at chapter 11. Chapter 11. The Lord said to Moses, I'll bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he'll let you go from here. And when he does, he will drive you out completely. Tell the people that men and women alike are to ask their neighbors for articles of silver and gold. Parenthetically, the Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and Moses himself was highly regarded in Egypt by Pharaoh's officials and the people, which is kind of a surprise given what they've just suffered through. But this is something that the Lord's doing, that the common folk have respect for Moses and actually have some affection for their Hebrew neighbors. So, continuing, Moses said, this is what the Lord says. About midnight, I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the slave girl who is at her hand mill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. There'll be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. But among the Israelites, not a dog will bark at a man or animal. Then you'll know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. All these officials of yours will come to me, bowing down before me and saying, go, you and all the people who follow you. And after that, I will leave. Then Moses, hot with anger, left Pharaoh. So see, he did talk to him again. The Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will refuse to listen to you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in Egypt. Moses and Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he wouldn't let the Israelites go out of his country. So the plague of the firstborn. And the way it reads, it says, the firstborn son of the Pharaoh. And you say, well, wait a minute. Well, what if the Pharaoh himself was the firstborn son? I don't think we're supposed to read it that way. I don't think we're supposed to mean like Andrew was born when my dad was still alive. My dad was the eldest son. I'm the only son. Andrew's my firstborn son. I don't think that means that if we were Egyptians, all three of us would die. I think it would mean, God forbid, that Andrew would die. I mean, I think it means in the household. I don't think it means everybody who happens to have been a firstborn son. I think it means in every house there will be a firstborn son die. Yeah, the Pharaoh's, if he has a son, that's who's going to die. The current Pharaoh's son, the firstborn son, is the one who's going to die. And yeah, that seems to be, well, there's something missing there too. And as the rabbi would say, well, that's unimportant. Well, maybe they did. I've learned it, and that's really unsatisfying to a lot of us. But, you know, a rabbi's answer to so many of these questions, sort of the what-if questions, are sometimes like, well, that detail is unimportant. You know, you don't need to worry about that. And us Western minds would go, well, wait a minute, though. I mean, the example when I was taking Hebrew classes, One of the classic examples, to jump back to Genesis for a minute, is, Adam and Eve have these two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. He's cast out of the garden. He's told he's going to be a wanderer for the rest of his life. He has the mark of Cain upon him. He goes and wanders in the land of Nod, which is the word that means wandering. He wanders in the land of wandering. And then you're reading along, it says, and Cain knew his wife, and Cain and his wife had these kids and these kids and these kids, and they had these people and all that. And us in the Western world are like, where did Cain's wife come from? And the rabbi said, that's unimportant. It doesn't matter. And he just dismisses the question because it doesn't matter to the point of the story. It doesn't matter to the point the story's trying to make. And to us in the Western world, we're like, but we kind of want to know. And that's the difference between a Western way of looking at the story and an Eastern way of looking at the story. They would go, why do you care about that? That doesn't matter to the story. So, yeah, your question would be one of those questions that they would go, well, yeah, that doesn't matter, which is unsatisfying to us who like logic and those kinds of things. But yeah, those questions that we always want to know, like, why in the world did you make mosquitoes? And well, there's this biological reason for the ecology. He does. Yeah, you won't care by the time we're in heaven. Those questions. So there's going to be a death in every household. I guess a single mom with daughters, there's not, because it is the firstborn son. But there's going to be wailing and gnashing of teeth everywhere. And this is the 10th and final plague, because now it's striking at the very heart of, Pharaoh is the protector of the land, and he is powerless to protect the land. As a son of the gods, he's powerless to do anything about it. So we read now of the Passover itself. The Lord, Yahweh, said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, this month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You're to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you must take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the people of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Don't eat the meat raw or cooked in water, but roast it over the fire, head, legs, and inner parts. Don't leave any of it till morning. If some of it is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you're to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It's the Passover. Does that sound like a group of people who can't get out of town fast enough? Or does that sound like this is how you celebrate a holiday? To me, it sounds like this is how you observe a holiday. This is how the Passover is to be celebrated in the future, to remember the events that this story is telling us about. But that instruction on how to celebrate these events is intermixed with the story itself. So, having said that, just for I won't go heavily into this, but if you've ever wondered, well, what the heck are we talking about here? There's too many of those, but this is how you celebrate the Passover meal. This is and I'm not going to, read this whole thing and go through all this. I might refer to a couple of pieces of it, but this is how you celebrate the Seder. Which, has anyone here ever been a part of a Seder meal or a Seder celebration? Okay, because some Christians do celebrate a Seder meal. this is just a reminder of all the things that are a part of a Seder meal. This is part of this ritual that remembers these events. And I'm not going to all of it. I'll refer back to it after we read some of these things. But you notice there's matzah, which is the bread that has no yeast in it, the flat, to me, not very tasty bread. There are 4 glasses of wine. There's the plate with all the various things on it. And the thing is, if you start with at 12 o'clock, there's a shank bone, which reminds them of the lamb. Next to that is, actually 12, at 12 are herbs, then the shank bone, then a mixture of apples, nuts, and spices, which reminds them of the mortar of building the bricks that they had to build. Then a vegetable, which reminds of how they initially flourished in the land of Goshen. Then bitter vegetables, about the bitterness of slavery. Then a hard-boiled egg, which is for the loss of the temples, etc. So you have the meals on the plate that are all a part of remembering the events. And I'll come back to that later. But if you want to look at that later, you can see that this is, the Passover is an event that is central to the Jewish people. And most Jews, even if they don't observe Judaism very regularly, even if they eat ham sandwiches, even if they don't go to synagogue, even if they don't observe the Sabbath, etc., even if they don't do, many of them will still celebrate Passover. Kind of like some Christians who will be at church on, Christmas and Easter. Many Jews, if they don't do anything else, they will celebrate Passover. But it's not, the Passover is not a celebration in the synagogue, it's a celebration in the home with a minimum of 10 people, with all the food items, and a ritual that goes with each food item and each glass of wine, and each part of the meal is a ritual that is to remind them of this event that we're reading about. So chapter 12 tells us about here's how to prepare for a Passover celebration. You got to have a lamb. You got to roast it. You got to have unleavened bread. You got to, when it comes time to actually eat the meal, you got to wear your coat and hat to remind you that your ancestors had to leave in a hurry. So you wear your coat and your hat, you sit at the table, you eat the foods that remind you of the various things about the meal, and you recite a ritual about what the events of the day. So let's keep reading about what that entails. Verse 12. On that same night, now the night, he says, on this night that you're eating the meal, you're eating the unleavened bread because you don't have time for it to rise and bake, that you're eating the lamb, the important piece of that, the really important piece of all that meal is what you do with the blood of the lamb. The lamb that you slaughter, that you're going to roast, you take his blood and you smear it on your doorpost. You take the blood of the lamb and you smear the blood on your doorpost. That's what, that's back in 12:7, chapter 12, verse 7. You're to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. The blood on the door is the crucial part of this. So, verse 12. On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals. I'll bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. Notice that. Not bringing judgment on the Pharaoh, not bringing judgment on the Egyptians. I'll bring judgment on the gods of Egypt. I will show that I am the true God and they are not real. In each plague, the Lord, Yahweh, God of the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In each of the plagues, he has symbolically defeated an Egyptian god. And this is the final straw. The blood, verse 13, the blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. So the blood on the doorpost, again, we're thinking in a kind of a, you think this sounds pretty primitive, but, there's no like address or house number on the door, or, there's blood on the door. And the idea is the angel of death, the destroyer, is what it's called. The angel of death is passing over all of Egypt, and every household there's a death, except for the houses where there is blood on the doorframe. Those are the houses that the angel of death, the destroyer, passes over. And that's it's the Passover. This is a day you are to commemorate. For generations to come, you shall celebrate it as a festival to Yahweh, a lasting ordinance. And here again, now we're back to how do you celebrate it? Now we're back to instructions on the celebration. For 7 days, you are to eat bread made without yeast. This is what the Jews would call the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Feast of Unleavened Bread. On the first day, you remove the yeast from your houses, for whoever eats anything with yeast in it, from the first day through the 7th day, must be cut off from Israel. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly, and another one on the 7th day. Don't work on all these days except to prepare food for everyone to eat. That is all you may do. So today, in Jewish homes, and again, how strictly this is observed would vary from Orthodox Jews, to conservative Jews, to Reform Jews, to secular Jews, to etc. And, how strictly this tradition is enforced. But for many Jewish households, before the Feast of Unleavened Bread, this is this week-long feast that culminates with Passover, they go through the cupboards, they go through the refrigerator, they go through the house looking for any food that contains yeast and remove it from their homes. They remove any food in the house that has yeast in it. Now, what a lot of modern Jews do, instead of just throwing it out, they box it up and give it to a Christian friend. And the Christian friend holds on to it for the week, and at the end of the week, the Christian friend gives them back the box with the foods that have yeast in it. So, matter of fact, in Israel, which, of course, we hear about Israel in the news pretty much every day. In Israel, what happens is that same thing happens, and the rabbis, the rabbis of Israel, box up the yeast and they give it to like a Christian bishop in Bethlehem or something. I mean, they give it to a high-ranking Christian leader in Israel is where they give their yeast for the week. But the idea is you got to get all the yeast out of the house. And there's games for children where they're supposed to go through the house hunting for yeast, and sometimes the parents will hide something that has yeast in it, a cracker or something, for the children to find so they can find the yeast and get rid of it. I mean, there's activities like that go along with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But you got to get the yeast out of the house. And the yeast, if you go through the Old Testament and even if you go through the New Testament, yeast is usually portrayed in a negative way in the Bible. Jesus says at one time, beware the yeast of the Pharisees. Yeast is often used as a symbol of something negative. Although, sometimes in the New Testament, it's a positive. Like, we are called to be light, and we're called to sometimes be the yeast that rises things up. So it's not always portrayed as a negative thing, but usually when you see yeast mentioned in the Bible, it's usually a symbol of corruption, or something you got to get rid of. So you got to go through, get rid of the yeast. Okay, now chapter 13. No, I haven't got to 13 yet. Okay, where was I? Okay, verse 17 of 12, 17:12. Celebrate the feast of unleavened bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. In the first month, you're to eat bread made without yeast from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. For 7 days, no yeast is to be found in your house. Whoever eats anything with yeast in it must be cut off from the community of Israel, whether he's an alien or a native born. Eat nothing made with yeast. I think we get the point maybe there after the fourth or fifth time. Wherever you live, you must eat unleavened bread, which remember is matzah. Then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel. Now we're kind of back away from how to remember the event to the event itself. Moses summoned the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go at once and select the animals for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on the top and on both sides of the doorframe. Not one of you shall go out the door of his house until morning. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and sides of the doorframe and will pass over that doorway. He will not permit the destroyer, aka angel of death, he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. Obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. When you enter the land that the Lord will give you, as he promised, observe this ceremony. And when your children ask you, 'What does this ceremony mean to you?' then tell them, 'It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians.'" Now, in a Passover, in a Seder celebration, part of the celebration is the youngest member of the household who is able to fulfill this responsibility as part of the liturgy. And he basically says to the table, "Why is this day different from all other days?" That's part of the liturgy. And then the elder at the table says, "We were slaves in Egypt." He doesn't say our ancestors were slaves in Egypt. He doesn't say our forefathers were slaves in Egypt. He says, "We were slaves in Egypt." And that's how the liturgy begins. And it goes and recites the events of the Passover. And then, that sheet I gave you, they have, they eat the various foods to remind them of the different things. This reminds us of the hard labor. This reminds us of the bitterness. This reminds us of the lamb. This reminds us of, etc. And most Jewish families don't actually roast a goat or a sheep or a lamb. They put the shank bone there on the plate, but they don't necessarily, they feel like that's sufficient to fulfill the remembrance part of the meal. So, but I always think it's really interesting that the liturgy doesn't say our ancestors were slaves. It says we were slaves. So, when your children ask you, verse 26, when the children ask you, "What does this ceremony mean to you?" you tell them, "It's the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt, spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians." Then the people bowed down and worshipped. The Israelites did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who sat in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well, those that survived the plagues and things. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt. There was not a house without someone dead. So this happens at midnight. During the night, verse 31, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. I thought he said, "I'll never see you again." Well, no. He says, "Up! Leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you've requested. Take your flocks and your herds, as you've said, and go. And also bless me." Now, that's an odd little comment at the end. I was reading one commentator who said he's probably basically saying, when he says bless me, he's like, lift this curse on me. Lift this curse that has been put on my household and my country and my people and my gods and my everything. Lift this curse. That's probably what he means by bless me. The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, which by this time you're not surprised. For otherwise, they said, we'll all die. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. Which, remember, it said that the Egyptians were disposed to do this, which sounds like a little, we kind of like, those two things maybe don't always match if they're like, you're the cause of our death, but here, take this gift, this parting gift. But that's God working, knowing that, one, this will be needed, and knowing probably how the people are going to sin later on with that gold. The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, gave them what they'd asked for, and they plundered the Egyptians. And I mentioned earlier that phrase often has taken to mean, at least in some Christian circles, taking something worldly and sort of using it for Christian purposes, like rock and roll. The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, plus women and children. And you're like, wait a minute, that means like 1 million people. If there's 600,000 men, not counting the women and children, that's like 1 million people. And which you think, okay, you start with 70 people who went in there, the family of Abraham and Jacob and the 12 tribes. 420 years later, or 430 years later, there's 1 million people. If you do the math, I mean, yeah, people have big families. Is that number historically accurate? That's a lot of people. Again, the rabbi would say, well, that's unimportant. The people went up with them, as well as large droves of livestock, flocks, and herds. When the dough they had brought from Egypt, they baked cakes and unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast, because they had been driven out of Egypt and didn't have time to prepare food for themselves, which is different from the instructions on how to have 7 days and all, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just remember, these two things are really on two tracks. The events of the first Passover and how to remember it in the years that follow. Now, the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. Because the Lord kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt, on this night all the Israelites are to keep vigil to honor the Lord for generations to come. You might say, well, now, when did this probably occur? What year are we talking about? Consensus of scholars is the Exodus is usually dated around the year 1250 BC, somewhere around 1250 BC. So over 1,000 years, obviously, before Jesus. David is usually dated right at 1000 BC. So this is 250 years before David. Verse 43. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "These are the regulations for the Passover. No foreigner is to eat of it. Any slave you have brought may," and you think, the slaves have slaves? No, this is, again, down the road. "Any slave you have bought may eat it after you've circumcised him, but a temporary resident and a hired worker may not eat of it. It must be eaten inside the house. Take none of the meat outside the house. Don't break any of the bones. The whole community of Israel must celebrate it. An alien living among you who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover must have all the males in his household circumcised. Then he may take part like one born in the land. No uncircumcised male may eat of it. Same law applies to the native born and to the alien living among you." All the Israelites did just what the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, and on that very day, the Lord brought the Israelites out of Egypt by their divisions. again, I got one more handout just that might, when you think about this holiday, well, here. When you think about Jewish holidays, here's just a simple chart of some of the holidays, kind of what time of the year are we talking about Passover and some of these other holidays. This one is for this year. This is 2024 calendar for Jewish holidays. Some of the holidays on here are modern Jewish holidays. They're not biblical Jewish holidays. They're more Israelite holidays. Like the very first one there, Tu B'Shvat. Tu B'Shvat is basically Israeli Arbor Day. It's kind of an eco day or Earth Day. So that's obviously not a biblical holiday. But the ones that are biblical holidays, if you kind of look at them through the year, Purim is the holiday that celebrates the events of Esther. The book of Esther, when through Esther's intercession, the plot to exterminate all the Jews by the king of Ahasuerus is foiled. The king of Persia is foiled. Purim celebrates the events of the book of Esther. Then Passover usually occurs, it occurred from the Feast of Unleavened Bread through Passover. This year it was April 22nd through the 30th. Passover often falls very close to Easter or even on Easter. Not always, but Passover often falls the same week as Easter. And there's a reason, because if you go to the New Testament, when is Jesus crucified? During the Passover festival. So it's obviously that's why the two holidays happen almost, very simultaneously. Shavuot is what we call Pentecost. It's 50 days after Passover. And so the Christian holiday of Pentecost occurred on Shavuot, which is 50 days after Passover. It was also 50 days after Easter. But the Holy Spirit came down on the Jewish day of Pentecost, which in Hebrew is Shavuot. The Rosh Hashanah, which is next week, is New Year. The Jewish year begins on Rosh Hashanah, so that's Jewish New Year, and it'll be the Jewish year like 58 something or 59 something. I can't remember how the Jewish calendar. In the Jewish calendar, it's getting close to the year 6000. It's like 58 something, 59 something in the Jewish calendar. That's next week. Yom Kippur follows Rosh Hashanah. Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement, the day of mourning. Sukkot is the Feast of Booths, which is another Jewish holiday where you have to live in a hut for a week, and it's a harvest festival. And then Hanukkah starts on Christmas Day this year. And as I mentioned before, if you search our Bible for the events of Hanukkah, you will not find them. They are in that intertestamental book of Maccabees that is about the Jewish revolt that drove the horrible blasphemers out of the temple, where they had to cleanse the temple and only had enough oil for a day, but the oil lasted 8 days miraculously, and that's where the candelabra with the 8 candles comes from. But you read about that in the book of Maccabees, which is not in our Bible. It's in a lot of Catholic Bibles. It's actually in that Bible right over there, the one on the communion table, has those intertestamental books as well. So anyway, but we're talking about Passover. So Passover, all that to say, it's going to be around the same time as Easter every year. Let's look at chapter 13. The Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me every firstborn male The first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether man or animal. Then Moses said to the people, commemorate this day, the day you came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, because the Lord brought you out of it with a mighty hand. Eat nothing containing yeast. Today, in the month of Abib, you're leaving. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Hivites, and Jebusites, which again is looking forward to 40 years after this, after 40 years of wandering, when the Lord does bring you into Canaan, the land he swore to your forefathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you're to observe this ceremony in this month. Here it gets a little repetitive. For 7 days, eat bread made without yeast. On the seventh day, hold a festival to the Lord. That's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, followed by the Passover. Eat unleavened bread during those 7 days, nothing with yeast in it to be seen among you, nor shall any yeast be seen anywhere within the borders. On that day, tell your son, I do this because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. This observance will be for you like a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead that the law of the Lord is to be on your lips. For the Lord brought you out of Egypt with a mighty hand. You must keep this ordinance at the appointed time year after year. The Bible, just sidelights, the Bible says the God's laws should always be a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead. And the Pharisees took this very literally. The Pharisees have these little boxes called phylacteries, little boxes that they wore on their wrist and wore on their forehead, and inside the little box was a scroll with scripture on it, so that they could literally have the law of the Lord on their forehead and on their right hand. So the Pharisees would wear these little prayer boxes to show that they were literally following the idea that God's law must be close at hand. There are ultra-Orthodox Jews still today that would do that. Not too many Jews would wear those today. After the Lord, verse 11, after the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites. Because remember, when they go into Canaan, they cross over with Joshua leading the charge. The first city they take is Jericho. Jericho's occupied. They have to conquer the cities of Canaan. Jericho's the first, but not the last. The Canaanites are already living in the land that God promised to the descendants of Abraham. So when you come into the land of the Canaanites and gives it to you, as he promised on oath to you and your forefathers, you are to give over to the Lord the first offspring of every womb. All the firstborn males of your livestock belong to the Lord. Redeem with a lamb every firstborn donkey. But if you don't redeem it, break its neck. Redeem every firstborn among your sons. The idea of the first fruits, whether of animal or grain, is a sacrifice to the Lord. We're going to see all through the Old Testament. You bring your first fruits as a sacrifice to the temple, or before the temple, the tabernacle. The idea of the firstborn son belongs to God is how the Jews did something very different from the pagan people. Sadly, or shockingly, or horribly, many of the pagan people, the firstborn son would be literally a child sacrifice to their gods. They would human sacrifice. The Jews never practiced human sacrifice. They never practiced ritual human sacrifice. But they did have a ceremonial gift to God to redeem the firstborn son who belongs to God. And we see that again in the New Testament. Mary and Joseph go to the temple on the 8th day with baby Jesus, and they have to do what? They have to make a sacrifice, if you remember. And it's, I think, 2 doves that they sacrifice because Jesus is the firstborn son that they are redeeming. Because he belongs to the Lord. Now, in Jesus' case, he very obviously does, but every firstborn son belongs to the Lord. So, in the days to come, verse 14, when the son asks you, what does this mean? Say to him, with a mighty hand, Yahweh brought us out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed every firstborn in Egypt, both man and animal. This is why I sacrifice to the Lord the first male offspring of every womb and redeem each of my firstborn sons with an offering to God to redeem, as in almost literally buy back from God this child because it belongs to God. It will be like a sign on your hand and a symbol on your forehead that the Lord brought us out of Egypt with his mighty hand. And so all this is now prelude to, in every movie, cartoon, or anything made about this story, the most dramatic scene. Because we're about to get to the sea at the end of chapter 13. It says in verse 13:17, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. They didn't take the most direct route to Canaan. God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. In other words, if they had to fight their way to Canaan through the Philistines, that maybe would not be the way to give them confidence to keep going. So he takes them on another route. He led the people around by the desert road towards the Red Sea, which there's some scholars say that should be translated the Sea of Reeds instead of the Red Sea, that it should be the Sea of Reeds. The Israelites went up out of Egypt armed for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph, remember, the 12 sons of Jacob, Joseph and Benjamin are the 11th and 12th sons, the two sons of Rachel, Jacob's favorite wife. He had two wives and two maids, concubines, that gave him the 12 sons. Remember, Joseph, of course, is the one who's sold into slavery and then becomes sort of the administrator of the food program in Egypt, which is what brings them all to Egypt in the first place. It says, they took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the sons of Israel swear an oath. He had said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you when you leave from this place. Which, if you go back, if you want to double check that, go to Genesis 50. Genesis 50:25, which is at the very tail end of Genesis, the last chapter of Genesis. Genesis chapter 50, actually go back to verse 24. Genesis 50:24. Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up on out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the sons of Israel swear an oath that said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. What do you think? He's the second youngest of the brothers. If he's 110, how old are his brothers? Because he's saying this to his brothers. But people lived a long time in some of these places. So that's the reference back to Genesis 50 about taking Joseph's bones, which had been sitting in a coffin for over 400 years now, that they could even remember where it was probably pretty miraculous that they knew where it was. So they take Joseph's bones, his coffin. Verse 20, after leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud or by day or the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. So they are following, God is literally leading them day and night with a cloud or with fire to lead them through the desert. Now, here we go to the big drama. Okay, verse chapter 14. The Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They're to encamp by the sea, directly opposite Baal Zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the desert in confusion, hammered in by the desert. And I'll harden Pharaoh's heart, and he'll pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh. So the Israelites did this. They camped there by the sea. Verse 5, when the king of Egypt, a.k.a. Pharaoh, was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds yet again and said, "What have we done? We've let the Israelites go and lost their services." In other words, we've lost our forced labor, our slaves. So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of his best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt and officers over all of them. And the Lord had hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He pursued the Israelites, who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi Hahiroth, opposite Baal Zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. And so you picture, here's on the horizon, here's chariots and all, an army coming after you. They were terrified and cried out to Yahweh, and they said to Moses, and this is the beginning of a litany over and over of these people complaining about everything. And you kind of can't blame them here too bad, but the way they complained is almost funny. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out to the desert to die?" Which just is a funny way, I think, of saying that. Is it because there were just no funeral plots in Egypt, that you had to bring us out here to die instead of just letting us die there? That you had to bring us out here in the middle of nowhere so we could die out in the middle of the desert instead of letting us die peacefully as slaves in Egypt? Is that why you brought us out here, just to die? He says, "What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." All those miracles, all those things, all the stuff that hit the Egyptians and kept them safe, and the Passover and the gold and the silver and all that stuff is quickly, we never wanted to leave. Why did you make us leave? We were happy being slaves. We love slavery. Why did you make us leave? And here we're out, now we're in the middle of nowhere, and we're all going to die. Why, Moses? Why'd you drag us out here? Moses answered the people, "Don't be afraid. Stand firm, and you'll see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you'll never see them again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Kind of emphasizing the fact that it's not like, okay, the Israelites are now armed for battle and they're going to go out there, and even though they're, overwhelmed, they're going to go fight those Egyptians and win the battle. No, they really are only totally dependent upon God rescuing them. They're not out there with their swords and fighting the Egyptians or whatever. They are totally dependent on God, and that's going to be the story throughout Exodus. They are totally dependent on God, literally a day at a time. It is a lesson of trust that they fail pretty frequently. And here's the first example of them complaining about it. Verse 15, the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on." In other words, you're wasting time, Moses. "Raise your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water, so the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I'll harden the hearts of the Egyptians so they'll go in after them, and I'll gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So, just, quit talking and get moving. Head towards the sea. Head towards the water. And the angel of the Lord, the angel of God, verse 19, who'd been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. So if you're picturing this pillar that's been leading them, suddenly the pillar moves from the front to the back as a wall between the Israelites and the Egyptian army. A sort of a temporary wall almost between the two groups. The pillar of cloud moved from the front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side. So neither went near the other all night long. So it's light on the Israel side, it's dark on the Egyptian side. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind. It's not just, it's all night long a wind pushing it back, pushing it back, pushing it back. The waters are divided. The Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. So, the famous scene in the Ten Commandments that, was the greatest special effect ever in the 1950s, the Cecil B. DeMille movie where the parting of the water. Special effects have moved along quite a bit since then. But did it look like that? Yeah, maybe not. Did it look like Prince of Egypt? Maybe that's closer. Remember, it's a wind is blowing, blowing, blowing. And I was going to give you all a map of all of this, and no two maps agree about exactly where this crossing took place. There's not really consensus. It's not like a giant, huge amount of water. It's probably a relatively narrow piece of water, but still enough that you couldn't just cross without drowning. I mean, deep enough and long enough that you couldn't cross without something miraculous happening. So they go through, verse 23. Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea on this dry land. And during the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He made the wheels of their chariots come off, so they had difficulty driving. Now, again, a lot of people say, if you think of this as more, a more natural explanation of how sometimes the water would dry up for a while, and there would be, and the ground is mud. You can walk on mud. You can't drive a chariot in the mud without getting stuck. You can't drive a chariot through deep, wet mud without getting stuck. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord's fighting for them against Egypt." And the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and their horsemen." And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing towards it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and the horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the great power the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses for a little while. It doesn't say that, but they put their trust in Moses and the Lord until the next problem arose, which is going to be frequent. As we read through Exodus, we're going to see one way the Lord describes, or the book describes, the Israelites is it calls them stiff-necked. Stiff-necked. And that expression, we kind of are picturing what it means to be stiff-necked. It means stubborn, not really easily convinced of things. And it's not going to be an easy journey in the desert. And there's going to be a lot of complaining, and there's going to be a lot of lessons in trust that ultimately many of the people are going to fail. This lesson of trust that God is trying to teach them and their children and their children's children, this idea of you have to have faith and you have to trust and know that God is going to provide. And the people learn that lesson kind of over and over and over, but they don't learn it very well. Then we have a whole chapter, or at least we have half a chapter, of a song, which, again, when you see this, and then it says Moses and the Israelites all sang this song, which it's kind of like a movie musical when suddenly everybody starts singing the song and they all know the words and it's all choreographed, and it's like if you watch a musical, you have to suspend disbelief a little bit. Like suddenly in the middle of the musical, everybody's singing in 4-part harmony and they all know the words and they even know the dance moves to the, suddenly in the middle of the show. Scholars would probably say, is this literally made up on the spot? Is this song literally spontaneously sung by everybody in the moment? Probably this song is composed later. And again, put in here. It probably is a song celebrating these events, which was maybe not sung within, minutes of the water covering the Egyptians. But it is a song that is exalting what had just happened. And let's kind of look at it, this song of Moses and Miriam. Remember, that's Moses' sister, older sister, the one who, when Moses was in the Nile in the little boat, and the princess of Egypt rescues him, Miriam is the one who says, shall I go get one of the Hebrew women to breastfeed him for you? And she's like, yeah, why don't you go do that? That's Miriam, his big sister. I will sing to Yahweh. He is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. He's my God. I'll praise him. My Father's God. I'll exalt him. Yahweh is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he's hurled into the sea. The best of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deep waters have covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you threw down those who opposed you. You unleashed your burning anger. It consumed them like stubble. By the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The surging waters stood firm like a wall. The deep waters congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy boasted, I will pursue, I'll overtake them, I'll divide the spoils, I'll gorge myself on them, I'll draw my sword, and my hand will destroy them. But you blew with your breath, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who among the gods is like you, Yahweh? Who's like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders? You stretched out your right hand, and the earth swallowed them. Kind of we're thinking like, okay, this is really a song celebrating death of the enemy, which in this case is, we'd say is appropriate. That's what they were celebrating, that God had rescued them from the enemy, and the enemy has been defeated. The enemy, God drowned them all. And some of the Psalms, of the 150 Psalms, the ones that we probably don't use as a call to worship, some of the Psalms are like that. They are about how God has defeated an enemy, how God has vanquished somebody. And some of them are pretty, graphic in the way they describe how God has defeated an enemy. Verse 13, in your unfailing love, you'll lead the people you've redeemed. In your strength, you'll guide them to your holy dwelling. The nations will hear and tremble. Anguish will grip the people of Philistia. The chiefs of Edom will be terrified. The leaders of Moab will be seized with trembling. The people of Canaan will melt away. Terror and dread will fall upon them. Now we're jumping ahead 40 years forward, because this is the people who occupy Canaan. This is the people that they are going to have to drive out to take ownership of what today we would call Israel. This is the Canaanites who are in the land of Canaan. All these peoples, all the ites, the Hittites and Jebusites and et cetera-ites, and the Philistines. These are the people that they're going to be fighting. Well, if you think about the Old Testament, the cycle of Israel fighting these various groups, the Philistines and all the other, groups, seems endless. It seems like there's an endless ongoing battle between the people of Israel and their neighbors attacking them. Does that sound at all like anything that's happening in the news today? Nothing in the Holy Land is new. Nothing in the news is something that hasn't been happening for thousands of years. It's none of this is a new thing. Now, the modern state of Israel, founded in 1948, is not a theocracy. It is a secular country. So it is not the same as the biblical Israel. It is a secular country that is occupied by Jewish people and Muslim people. And some of them are Orthodox Jews. Many of them are semi-practicing Jews. Some of them are atheist Jews, which almost sounds like a contradiction. How could you be Jewish and an atheist? Well, they're Jewish by culture, Jewish by birth, but they don't practice Judaism as a religion. So the modern state of Israel is not a theocracy, as a country where the religion is, Iran is a theocracy because the Ayatollah, the religious leader, is the ruler of Iran. It is a theocracy. Israel is not. But the fact that the Jewish people, surrounded by enemies who want to destroy them, is something that's been going on, since this time and off and on. The Jews have not always had a homeland in Palestine or in Canaan, but nothing that's happening there is unique in history. But this is looking forward to all the people they're going to be fighting, the Philistines, the Edomites, the Moabites, etc. Verse 16, by the power of your arm, they'll be still as a stone, until your people pass by, O Lord, until the people you bought pass by. You'll bring them in and plant them on the mountain of your inheritance, the place, O Lord, you made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, Lord, your hands established. The Lord will reign forever and ever. When Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen went into the sea, the Lord brought the waters of the sea back over them. But the Israelites walked through the sea on dry land. Then Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister, also Moses' sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women followed her, and with tambourines and dancing, Miriam sang to them, sing to the Lord, he's highly exalted, the horse and the rider are hurled into the sea. That's a much briefer song. And I tend to think that is the song that was sung immediately, that one verse there in verse 21. That probably is the song that was sung by tambourine immediately after the event. The one that takes up almost all of chapter 15 is a probably later song commemorating those same events, but a little more time probably passed when this song is composed. So let's finish out chapter 15. When Moses led Israel from the Red Sea and they went into the desert of Shur, then he did that. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water, which in that part of the world, there's not, water is precious and scarce at times. They came to Marah. They couldn't drink its water because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Marah. The word Marah and the word Miriam and the name Mary are all the same word. They all mean bitter. That's why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, what are we to drink? Again, he led us out here to die of thirst. Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. Now, I'm not sure of the physics behind that. I'm not sure, I think we have to take this as miraculous as well. What would turn bitter water into sweet water? But the bottom line is the water becomes drinkable and they're able to drink. The Lord made a decree and a law for them, and there he tested them. He said, if you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I won't bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am Yahweh who heals you. They came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. So they come to what we might call an oasis at that point, where there is water. And their trials and tribulations are not going to end, because the next problem is going to be food. Got water, but you got to have food too, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the desert. And you probably know at least part of that story. That we'll start there next time with manna. The story of the manna and the quail, and how God feeds them for 40 years. But the underlying story, really, all through this is, as the people are learning, or trying to learn. God's trying to teach them trust in his providence, trust that he's going to provide, trust that he will, and it almost becomes. Later on, just a spoiler, it almost becomes a comedy, because when they rebel and they rebel and they rebel and they're stiff-necked and they complain, you have these dialogues between God and Moses, God, Moses will say, Lord, your people are, not following you. And God will say to Moses, Moses, your people are not following you. I mean, there are times when God refers to them as Moses' people, and Moses refers to them as God's people. They're both like, yeah, they're your problem. Oh, no, actually, they're your problem. I mean, they kind of go back and forth on that. One of the great things about Moses, and I think really about most of the great saints, Old Testament saints, whether it's Abraham or whether it's Moses or they're very blunt with God. They're not afraid to speak their mind to God. They're not afraid to say when they're upset or when they're sad, when they're worried, when they're mad, they're not, they talk with God very frankly, and God does not get mad at that. God is not offended by them talking to him in a very blunt way. Why, God? Why are you doing this? That's often the cry of these people in the Old Testament, and God is not bothered by that. And God is not bothered by that. I'd say when we are very frank with him and very blunt with him, he's pretty tough. God's pretty tough. He can pretty much take anything we want to say to him and not be thin-skinned. So anyway, I think I better quit because it's about 25 after, and I never officially said to folks online, hopefully this is all coming through good. We've got our bugs fixed, and we're glad if you're watching this right now or watching this later on our website or on Facebook or YouTube or wherever you're watching. We're glad you're a part of us, and we'll be back again next Wednesday. So let's pray. Lord, we're grateful for these stories that remind us that you are a God of deliverance, that you're a God we can trust, that we can trust you to fulfill your promises, that we can lean on you, that you will provide for us. Not always maybe exactly how we picture it, but you will take care of us. Thank you for being there for us. Thank you for letting us call you Father. Thank you for letting us call you our Lord, our God, the lover of our souls, a good and compassionate Lord. We love you, Lord, and thank you, Lord. Amen.